It is a truth seldom acknowledged, outside the more harrowing portions of Trollope, that no English wedding worth its florist's bill may proceed unpunctuated by calamity. Whether it be a missing ring, a mislaid bishop, or a mistaken bridegroom, some monstrous little disaster must needs insert itself between the procession and the port, lest the whole affair fall to the level of the merely competent. Thus, when Miss Agatha Molland fainted neatly into the asparagus fern 5 minutes before her betrothal to the Honourable Nicholas Fanshawe, the gathered assembly, though horrified, felt a subtle thrill of satisfaction. It was, at least, a proper wedding. The village of Great Pagwell, which boasts one public house, 2 rectors, and no surviving industry save gossip, had not seen a Fanshawe wedding in a generation. Nor had it ever, so far as local memory served, hosted the singular presence of Lord Peter Wimsey, who arrived not, as might be supposed, in a Rolls-Royce, but via the village charabanc, having taken an impish pleasure in alarming the driver. With a half-baked inquiry about fuel efficiency and Georgians, Wimsey, of course, was not on the guest list. He rarely was. His presence at the nuptials was due entirely to his being once, long ago, and to the regret of at least one opera company, very nearly betrothed to the bride's formidable aunt, Lady Hermione Molland, née Tolliver. That particular alliance had ended with a duel of sonnets and a remarkable episode involving a disguised baritone and a stolen cabochon. Nevertheless, Aunt Hermione had invited him out of either sentiment or spite, and possibly in hopes that his mere appearance might reinvigorate her gout-ridden husband into jealousy or cardiac action, either being preferable to continued political commentary. The affair was to be held in the floral-festooned nave of St. Swithin's, a church so picturesque that it had recently featured in the Ladies' Quarterly Guide to Rustic Piety. The groom, the Honourable Nicholas, stood at the altar in an attitude of braced surrender, flanked by a best man of startling good looks, one Mr. Dominic Mew, a childhood friend of the Fanshawes and, until last year, a reasonably competent playwright. As the bride's entrance was announced, murmurs stirred the pews. Then at the threshold a swan-like pause, and Miss Agatha crumpled like a poorly stacked deck of cards. Pandemonium, well-mannered, of course, ensued. Wimsey, who had been occupying a pew near the rear and quietly timing the acoustics of the bell tower, stood and ambled forward with that gait best described as an aristocratic slouch. He reached the altar just as the vicar cried for someone to fetch Dr. Weatherstone, or failing that, sherry. Perhaps, murmured Wimsey, bending over the unconscious bride with exaggerated delicacy, we should postpone the vows until she can remember whom precisely she was marrying. These things are best conducted with full consent of the conscious. There was an awkward silence. The vicar coughed. Lady Hermione glared. Wimsey straightened, dusting his gloves. Of course, he added brightly, it may be only the usual tremor of wedding nerves, or, more interestingly, something rather less convenient. It was not until an hour later, after the guests had been quietly shepherded out with promises of sandwiches and explanations, that the body of Dominic Mew, the best man, was found in the vestry, face down, dead, and very clearly bludgeoned with the ceremonial silver-bound Bible stand. Wimsey, summoned by the sharp-voiced housekeeper, who had gone looking for a spare smelling salts bottle, entered the scene with that mildly interested air one might adopt on finding the milk turned or an unexpected umbrella in one's cupboard. Well, he said, removing his monocle and peering with detached interest at the sprawled figure. That explains the bride's little performance. Second sight or second thoughts? Dr. Weatherstone, who had finally arrived, paled at the sight. Good. Lord, he breathed. But who? Why would anyone kill the best man? Lord Peter raised one brow. Perhaps, he said thoughtfully, because the first best man was otherwise engaged, or perhaps someone objected to the ceremony more strenuously than etiquette allows. He crouched, delicately lifted a stained corner of the victim's sleeve and sniffed. Curious, he murmured. Lilac water and onions, not quite the scent of holy matrimony. With a sigh of infinite amusement, Lord Peter Wimsey rose and turned to the small gathering now clustered in the doorway. Rector, Doctor, Aunt Hermione, the groom, looking rather less bereaved than one might expect, and an increasingly distraught bridesmaid. "Perhaps," said Whimsy, "before the constabulary arrives and befuddles the matter utterly, we might begin with the usual game. Who was the last to see the dear fellow alive, and, if it isn't too forward, was he in the habit of quoting Euripides when nervous?" He smiled, that brilliant, maddening, light-footed smile, and drew a small notebook from his coat. "I believe," said Lord Peter Wimsey, "we are in for a jolly unpleasant puzzle." Lord Peter Wimsey remained by the body longer than decorum, or indeed clerical comfort, strictly permitted, his expression one of faint academic curiosity. He had turned, Mr. Mew's right hand palm up, and was gently prodding a curious stain on the cufflink with the tip of a matchstick. Behind him the rector hovered, quite beside himself, muttering half-prayers and wholly ineffectual protestations about the sanctity of the vestry. "Do take heart, Reverend," Wimsey murmured. "There's no desecration here, merely inquiry. The man is unfortunately beyond offence, and the room," he turned slowly, eyes wandering across the cluttered sanctum, "offers more peculiarities than reverence." He paused to admire a cracked stained-glass panel depicting St. Bartholomew, holding his flayed skin with what could only be described as unnerving composure. Dr. Weatherstone knelt beside the corpse now, fumbling with a stethoscope more out of habit than necessity. "Blow to the back of the head," he confirmed unnecessarily. "Likely instantaneous. Heavy object, blunt force. Bible stand would certainly do it." Wimsey straightened, dusting his trousers. "Yes, a fine choice of weapon. Lurid, symbolic. Perfect for a murder staged during a wedding. One might say it makes the point rather literally. What do you suppose, Reverend? Is there precedent for martyrdom by ecclesiastical furnishings?" The rector opened his mouth, then closed it again. Just then the door creaked open, and Sergeant Keeling stepped into the room with the air of a man desperately regretting promotion. He was ruddy-faced, broad-nosed, and already perspiring beneath the collar. His glance swept the vestry and landed unhappily on the body. "Good Lord," he muttered. "That's Mew. The playwright, isn't he?" "Among other things," Wimsey said pleasantly. "A poet, a friend of the groom, and now, alas, very much beyond further creative output." Keeling blinked, then sniffed. "Who found him?" "That honour," Wimsey said, nodding to the elderly housekeeper, who now hovered behind the sergeant like a moral spectre, "belongs to Mrs. Attleby, sent in to recover some smelling salts for the bride, who fainted with such grace that I suspected artifice until this made it rather more alarming," Keeling grunted. "Right, nobody leave the premises. I dare say most people were hoping for a swift departure," said Wimsey. "Weddings tend to scatter guests faster than revolutions, though I must point out, Sergeant, that those who linger may prove more interesting than those who fled." Housekeeper, who had stood silent all this time, now cleared her throat. "Beg pardon, my lord, but I did hear something odd when I came in, before I saw the body." "Do tell," said Wimsey, turning with alert politeness. "I heard humming, a tune like, low and slow, couldn't place it." "Fascinating," Wimsey said. "Death and melody, how very Wagnerian." He made a note of it, then turned to Keeling. "Shall we begin with interviews? The bride is out of commission, I assume." Keeling nodded. "Still fainted. Then let's begin with the groom," Wimsey said. And in his tone was a hint of mischief barely disguised as method. "I find men at the altar, particularly bereft of brides and best men, tend toward honesty. If only from shock, Nicholas Fanshawe had been relocated to the sacristy, where he sat pale-faced and oddly composed, sipping something that looked disturbingly like crème de menthe. He looked up as Wimsey entered and gave a shaky nod. "I suppose you want to ask about Dominic, if you'd be so kind," Wimsey said, sitting opposite him. "Start with the usual banalities. When did you last see him alive?" Fanshawe blinked. "Just before the procession. We spoke in the antechapel. He was adjusting my cravat and making some joke about the garters. Yours or the bride's?" Fanshawe gave a weak laugh. "Mine, I think. He was always flippant. Said a wedding without scandal was a waste of good cake." "Prophetic," Wimsey murmured. "And did he say anything else of note?" Fanshawe shook his head. "No, he asked if I was nervous. I said yes. He clapped me on the back and told me not to worry, that someone always gets cold feet. Then he walked off, presumably to the vestry." Wimsey leaned back. Did you have words recently, disagreements? Fanshawe frowned. No, we were close, at school together. He stayed at the manor last night. Nothing seemed strange. Nothing ever does, Whimsy said lightly. Until it does. And what of Miss Molland? Was she fond of him? There was a pause. I don't think so, said Fanshawe slowly. They got on, but she thought him rather shallow, too clever by half. Most people do think that of playwrights, Whimsy observed. Did he disapprove of the marriage? I don't know, Fanshawe said, and now his voice held something uncertain. He joked about it. Said Agatha was marrying into a ghost house. My family history isn't exactly free of skeletons. We had an uncle who shot himself in the conservatory. Dominic made a play out of it once. Not very tasteful. Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly. Did Agatha see that play? I believe. So she didn't like it. Thought it morbid. Said it turned grief into spectacle. Indeed, said Whimsy. And yet here we are. The next half-hour was spent assembling fragments. Mrs. Attleby's account of the humming, no one else heard it. The Reverend's insistence that the Bible stand had been moved 2 days prior and left by all accounts in the choir room, and the curious admission by one of the bridesmaids, Miss Elvira Stokes, that she had seen someone in the vestry corridor just before the collapse of Miss Molland. I didn't see the face, she said. Only the back, dark coat tall, walking away from the vestry toward the cloisters. And not Dominic? Whimsy asked. I don't think so. This figure walked oddly. A limp. Dominic was always graceful. Whimsy tapped his notebook. So, he murmured, we have a bride who collapses, a body with a blow to the back of the head, a humming heard only by one, and an unknown limping figure departing the scene. Plus the small matter of a ceremonial object relocated with improbable secrecy. He paused. And Muddy added softly, a best man who joked about cold feet and wrote tragedies about the families of his friends. The air in the sacristy was growing cooler. Outside the bells had ceased. The guests had drifted off or stood murmuring near the lich gate. Sergeant Keeling was speaking with Lady Hermione, who was declaring that murder at a wedding was so continental. Whimsy gazed at the quiet church and murmured, half to himself, a staged death, a ruined ceremony, and the scent of onions and lilac. My dear Dominic, did you write your own exit scene? But his eyes were not on the body. They were fixed, thoughtfully on the far wall where a long velvet curtain, usually drawn, was now half pulled aside, revealing a narrow door with an old bronze handle, a door he did not recall seeing earlier. He smiled. Well, he said softly, let's see who else was in attendance at this blessed union. And without another word he rose and slipped through the door. The narrow door opened with an ecclesiastical groan, its hinges resisting as though reluctant to betray what lay beyond. Whimsy slipped through with the feline stealth of a man used to quiet thresholds and louder consequences. He found himself in a low corridor, dimly lit by a single narrow window of rippled glass, its diamond panes smeared with the evidence of birds too trusting or too blind. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and old hymnals. He moved slowly, noting each uneven flagstone, each scratch along the wainscoting. The corridor, it seemed, had once connected the vestry to a small robing room, and then beyond that, to the crypt, a modest, dusty affair housing several centuries of Molland family dead, together with a few forgotten clerics and at least one bishop whose effigy wore a mitre too large for the niche and had been affectionately nicknamed Big Head by the choir boys. It was not the crypt, however, that interested Whimsy. Just before, the robbing room, the corridor angled slightly and revealed a second door, lighter, modern, fitted with a Yale lock that struck a distinctly heretical note against the medieval stones. Whimsy tried the handle. Locked. Naturally. He crouched, drawing from his pocket a slim leather-bound case that, while bearing the monogram PDJW in gold tooling, contained no devotional materials. A minute later, the lock surrendered with a reluctant click. The room beyond had all the marks of hasty preparation. A chair, straight-backed and armless, stood beside a collapsible table, the kind one might find at village fetes beneath wobbling sponge cakes. Upon the table lay a sheet of notepaper, with a few lines scrawled in thick, angular writing. Whimsy bent over it. The first mistake is the one you make on purpose. The second is the one that follows you into silence. No signature, no date. He lifted. The page by its corner sniffed it, frowned. Printer's ink, recent. He glanced around. A brass lamp, recently extinguished. Several cigarette ends in an ashtray, Turkish, expensive. A curtain over the narrow window, drawn, held by a brooch. He plucked the brooch free. Jet, inlaid with silver. Mourning jewelry, Victorian, female. He turned it over in his palm, then slipped it into his pocket. Now why, he mused aloud, would our best man be composing riddles in borrowed rooms, unless, of course, he expected company? A faint noise behind him, perhaps footsteps, perhaps merely his own heartbeat catching up with the situation, made him freeze. He waited, but the corridor beyond remained still. He pocketed the note, closed the door softly behind him, and made his way back the way he had come. Sergeant Keeling had taken up post in the main aisle and was arguing with Lady Hermione over whether the vicar should be compelled to remain on church grounds. Lady Hermione's voice, with its curious blend of moral indignation and operatic projection, was easy to locate. Whimsy veered left, avoiding the confrontation, and re-entered the vestry. The body had been covered now, a clean altar cloth draped, with more piety than precision. Whimsy stood looking at it for a long moment before turning to the doctor, who remained rather glumly in a corner with his black bag. "Doctor," Whimsy said, "forgive my prying, but when precisely do you believe the time of death occurred?" Weatherstone glanced up, surprised. "Difficult to be exact, but I'd place it between 10:30 and 10:45. He was found just after 11, and there's little sign of rigor or bleeding after the blow." Whimsy nodded. "So, during the procession, or slightly before, the bride's collapse." "Quite so. Then someone had the opportunity," said Whimsy, "not merely to kill poor Dominic, but to arrange the body, flee the vestry unseen, and return to their seat, all without raising alarm. Unless, of course, they weren't expected to be in the pews at all." He tapped his temple thoughtfully. "We must, dear Sergeant," he said, rejoining Keeling, "speak with the bridesmaids in detail, and I should very much like to revisit the subject of this morning's arrangements. Who dressed in which room, when, and with whom? You think one of the women did it. I think," said Whimsy, "that someone took advantage of sacred ceremony to commit a thoroughly profane act, and that the trappings of pageantry have made everyone assume too much about who was where and when." The bridesmaids, assembled with some effort in the chancel, sat in a tense semicircle. They looked like the minor goddesses of some dishevelled pantheon, a little too much rouge, a little too little appetite for murder. Elvira Stokes, who had already spoken to Whimsy, sat with her gloves in her lap, and her expression poised somewhere between boredom and dread. Next to her, Fenella Brooke was biting a hangnail. The third, Jane Heath, sat stiffly, eyes straight ahead. Whimsy studied them for a moment, then smiled. "Ladies," he said, "I shall be mercifully brief. A man is dead. We are, as it happens, inside a church, though I promise not to moralize. I merely wish to clarify some timelines." He turned first to Jane. "Miss Heath, where were you between 10:30 and 11 this morning?" Jane blinked. "With Agatha, the bride. We were in the west chamber of the rectory. I helped her dress." "And did she seem herself?" Jane hesitated. "She was quiet, tense, but not unusually so." Whimsy nodded, turned to Fenella. "And you?" "I was in the robing room," she said, "with the groom's party. I was fixing Dominic's boutonniere." "Ah, so you saw him shortly?" "Before he died?" "Yes," she said slowly. "He asked if I'd walk with him after the ceremony, said he had something to explain." "Did he say what?" "No." Her voice faltered. "But he looked sad, almost frightened." "Thank you," said Whimsy. Gently, then turned last to Elvira. "And you, Miss Stokes?" Elvira crossed her legs and folded her arms. "I was waiting in the south transept, reading the service card, and watching people. Anyone behaving oddly?" "Yes," she said. "Agatha. When she arrived at the church, she kept looking at the choir stalls, like she expected someone to be hiding there." Whimsy's eyes sharpened. "And when she fainted?" She looked straight at the vestry door, Elvira said. Then her knees just gave out. There was a silence. Wimsey inclined his head. Ladies, you've been most illuminating, and I dare say, more observant than many a deacon. He returned. To Keeling, thoughtful. Dominic knew something, he said quietly. He had secrets, likely about the bride or the groom. He was planning to tell someone, perhaps Agatha, perhaps not. Keeling frowned. And he wrote a note about mistakes. Yes, said Wimsey. A note, a secret meeting room, and a brooch that doesn't match any of the bridesmaids' ensembles. So, who does it belong to? That, Wimsey said, is what I mean to discover, but I have a theory. He broke off. There, beyond the lich gate, moving swiftly across the gravel path, was a tall figure in a long coat, limping. Wimsey smiled, brief, bright like the glint of a scalpel. Excuse me, Sergeant, he said, already striding away. I believe one of our ghosts is attempting an unceremonious exit. The figure did not run precisely. It moved with a fluid urgency, a determined purposefulness that seemed only marginally encumbered by the limp. The coat flared slightly. With each step, the right shoulder drawn high as though from habit or habitus. Wimsey, long-legged and deceptively spry, was after them almost immediately, cutting across the damp lawn and through the little side gate leading to the vicarage's rear path. The gravel crunched faintly beneath his soles, but he made no attempt at silence. Pursuit, in his view, was often more productive when the pursued knew he was being followed. The figure turned a sharp corner past the tool shed, glanced back, and paused, just long enough for Wimsey to close the gap. Then he saw her. She was tall, older than the bridesmaids by a good decade, and carried herself with the tight, economical posture of someone who had long ago learned to mask emotion through control. Her face, when she turned fully to him, was familiar. The bride's aunt on her mother's side, Mrs. Clarice Netheridge, widowed twice and seldom seen without gloves. Lord Peter, she said crisply. You startled me. Wimsey gave a bow. Forgive the intrusion. I often forget that haste is a vice among the respectable. She drew her coat tighter. Is this about Dominic Mew? I fear it must be, he replied. One doesn't walk away from a murder scene without raising eyebrows. Or in this case, monocles. She said nothing for a moment, then, I didn't kill him. Wimsey smiled faintly. Few murderers admit it with so little prompting. But you must see why the question arises. You were not in the church at the time of the fainting, nor did you appear during the commotion. And more intriguingly still, someone left behind a piece of Victorian jet. I believe it matches your collection. A mourning brooch, perhaps, gifted during your second widowhood? Her face gave nothing away, but her hand twitched, a minuscule betrayal lost to most eyes. Not to his. I lost it 2 days ago. She said finally. Somewhere in the church, I thought. I looked for it, but assumed it had fallen between pews, or been pulled loose during a scuffle, Wimsey said gently. Mrs. Netheridge, what was Dominic Mew doing in that back room? Why was there a cryptic note and the remains of a solitary vigil? Who was he waiting for? She did not answer at once. Then she looked up at the grey sky and exhaled. Agatha came to me last week, she said quietly. She was frightened. She'd found letters, old ones. Love letters from Dominic, dated before she was engaged to Nicholas. She hadn't realized how involved they'd once been. Indeed, Wimsey murmured. And he? He still loved her. Or thought he did. He said he wanted to fix things. Said the wedding was a mistake. He was unstable, Lord Peter. His plays, his life. It was all performance. But this was real and he didn't know what to do with it. Did he threaten to intervene? She hesitated. Not directly, but he asked me to speak to Agatha. To persuade her. I refused. But you met him anyway. I did. Yesterday. This evening. In the crypt of all places. He liked the drama of it, said it suited the tone. She gave a brittle laugh. He told me he'd written something for her. A final confession. Not quite a play, not quite a letter. He wouldn't let me read it. And this morning, she shook her head. I came early. I thought perhaps I could reason with him, get him to leave. I waited in that back room, but he never came. Because by then, Wimsey said softly, he was already dead. She nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement. Whimsy said nothing, for a while. Then, with deliberate slowness, he took the brooch from his pocket and handed it to her. "You will, I trust, remain within conversational reach." "I will," she said, "for her sake." He inclined his head and turned back toward the church. Back in the nave, the constables were now combing the vestry with more diligence than direction. Sergeant Keeling intercepted Whimsy with a raised brow. "Well?" "Family secrets, thwarted affections, and clandestine brooches," Whimsy replied airily. "But no murderers yet, only motives." "Charming," muttered Keeling. Whimsy ignored him and made his way to the side aisle, where the organ sat silent and dusted with hymnals. There he found the vicar again, attempting to shield a visibly shaken altar boy from the mutterings of Lady Hermione, who was declaring loudly that all great families possessed a few inconvenient corpses. "I wonder," said Whimsy to the vicar, "could I borrow the church keys? I'm interested in your side entrances, especially the one leading from the sacristy to the outer cloister. The one few people seem to remember." The vicar blinked. "It's never used. The lock's half rusted." "Nevertheless," said Whimsy, "it might have been oiled recently." The vicar hesitated, then produced the keys with visible reluctance. Whimsy tested the cloister door. It yielded easily, a little too easily. He studied the frame and found beneath the lintel a faint smear of dark oil, fresh, and just inside, a footprint, distinctly masculine, narrow-soled and left behind in the grit that had blown in from the courtyard. He measured it mentally, then looked out. The path led past the sacristy wall and joined the church's eastern flank, secluded, but still visible from the lane if one was watching. And someone had been watching. Elvira Stokes, perhaps. She'd seen someone limping, but no one had yet mentioned where that figure had gone next. Perhaps into the vicarage, perhaps not. He needed to speak with Agatha. The bride had been moved to the upper sitting room of the vicarage, attended by 2 maids and Lady Hermione, who had finally consented to tea as a substitute for scandal. Whimsy entered quietly and found Agatha sitting pale and blank-eyed beside the hearth. She looked up when he entered and gave a wan, brittle smile. "Lord Peter," she said, "have they decided I fainted out of vanity or guilt?" "Neither," he said gently, pulling up a chair. "Though the matter of your collapse has become rather more intriguing since the best man turned up dead." "I didn't kill him," she said at once, too quickly. "No," said Whimsy, "I don't think you did." She blinked. "You don't?" "Certainly not. A bride does not faint before learning of a murder unless she's an actress of rare and premature instincts, or saw something that disturbed her. She began, then stopped. "Miss Molland," Whimsy said, "did you see someone enter the vestry before you came in?" "Yes," she whispered. "Just a flash, a coat. At first I thought it was Dominic. But then I saw the limp. It wasn't his walk." "And why didn't you speak up?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I wasn't sure it wasn't Nicholas." Silence. Whimsy exhaled softly. "I see." She reached into her sleeve and handed him a small envelope. "I found this last night, in the drawer of his study. It's Dominic's handwriting, I recognized it, but it was addressed to Nicholas." Whimsy opened it slowly. "Nick, I know about Vienna. I know about the girl. I'm not angry, but you mustn't let her come here. If Agatha finds out, it'll destroy her. Tell me you've ended it. D." He folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said, her eyes widened. "What does it mean?" "That," he said, rising, "is the final piece of Act 1, and I fear Act 2 will be rather less civil." He turned to leave, already forming the questions he would ask next. Someone had silenced Dominic Mew, not for love nor hate, but fear, and fear, Whimsy knew, left footprints even where blood did not. Whimsy returned to the churchyard with a brisk, almost cheerful stride, though his mind churned in methodical disquiet. The letter from Dominic to Nicholas had altered the geometry of the entire puzzle. Vienna. A girl. An affair so dangerous it could destroy Agatha. It wasn't the content alone that intrigued him, but the tone. Dominic's language was not vengeful, not moralizing. It was protective, even loyal, and that made his death all the more inconvenient. He found Sergeant Keeling near the vestry steps, still overseeing the constables and the poor half-distraught vicar, who was by now muttering about suspending all weddings for the foreseeable future and possibly converting the parish to strict Quakerism. Wimsey tapped Keeling on the shoulder and handed him the envelope. "Dominic wrote this to Nicholas," he said, "found by the bride in her fiancé's study. It's about a certain indiscretion abroad, likely recent, likely compromising." Keeling read it, frowning. "So the groom's been unfaithful. Doesn't mean he's a killer." "No," Wimsey agreed, "but it provides motive, particularly if Dominic was pressing the matter. Blackmail, however well-intentioned, is still blackmail, especially when reputations are on the line." Keeling grunted. "We'll need to question the groom again." "I believe I'll do that," Wimsey said lightly. "You know how they wilt under official suspicion, rather like azaleas in fog." Nicholas Fanshawe had been moved to the manor house for rest and a brandy. Wimsey arrived to find him in the sunroom, still in his wedding coat, the collar open and his hair damp as if recently washed. He looked up with the unease of a man already cornered by his conscience. "Lord Peter," he said, and attempted a smile. "Have they arrested anyone yet?" "No," Wimsey said, "but we've begun to eliminate possibilities. Curious thing, murder. It forces all the lies into the daylight. One finds oneself longing for polite theft, or even a hearty bit of embezzlement." Nicholas sighed. "You've found something." "I have." Wimsey produced the letter and laid it gently on the side table. "From Dominic. To you." The colour drained from Nicholas's face, not violently, but with the slow, resigned seepage of a man who knows a tide is coming and has neither boat nor boots. "She found it?" he asked quietly. "She did." Nicholas stared at the paper. "It's true, Vienna. I was stupid, careless. There was a girl, nothing lasting, nothing that meant anything. But Dominic found out. He threatened to tell Agatha unless I ended it. Said he didn't want her hurt. And did you end it?" "I tried," Nicholas said. "But the girl, Clara, she followed me back to England. She wrote letters. One of them must have reached Dominic. He said he'd wait until after the wedding to speak with me again, to give me time to do the decent thing. But he didn't wait." Wimsey finished for him. "He tried to stop it outright." Nicholas's jaw clenched. "He meant well, but he was overstepping. You argued with him this morning?" "No, I didn't see him, not after the dressing room." "Where were you during the bride's procession?" "In the antechapel, alone." "No one to confirm that?" Nicholas looked away. "No." Wimsey nodded slowly. "And the limp? You injured?" Nicholas blinked. "What?" "One of the witnesses saw a tall figure with a limp leaving the vestry corridor just before the bride collapsed." "I don't limp," he said, confused. "Never have." "Then someone wants us to think you do, or perhaps someone else does, and dressed to resemble you." Nicholas looked genuinely puzzled. Wimsey noted the response, then stood. "Last thing," he said. "The morning of the wedding, did you notice if Dominic was carrying a bag, a satchel, anything out of place?" Nicholas frowned. "Yes, a brown folio, leather. He never let go of it." "Where is it now?" "I don't know," he said. "It wasn't with him when he was found." "No," said Wimsey softly, "and that may be the most important thing of all." By late afternoon, the church grounds had been cordoned off more formally. The guests had gone, though gossip lingered in the hedgerows like perfume after a dance. Wimsey walked the perimeter of the building slowly, his eyes drawn not to what was obvious, but to what was missing. He paused near the north transept, where the ivy grew thick and ragged against the stone. A short distance beyond, hidden from the road, stood the refuse shed, rarely used. He opened the creaking door. Inside, amid broken buckets and rusted trowels, sat a leather folio case, carefully placed and wiped clean. Wimsey opened it. Inside were several typed sheets, each with stage directions and dialogue. At first it seemed to be a play, but the characters were not fictional. Agatha, Nicholas, Clarice, Dominic. Each line of dialogue was a confession, a confrontation, or an accusation. It was, in effect, a dramatized version of the week's events, altered only enough to blur plausible deniability. Dominic had planned a private reading, or a performance, perhaps even a confrontation disguised as art. There were marginal notes. Ask Nicholas about the telegram. Brooch prop? Crypt scene, echo too strong, adjust voice. Whimsy whistled through his teeth. So this, he murmured, was the real mistake. Not the affair, not even the secret room, but thinking murder wouldn't dare take the stage. He closed the case and returned to the church. In the vestry, Keeling looked up. Find something? Yes, said Whimsy. A manuscript, rehearsal notes, a tragedy in one act with an unwanted premiere. Keeling swore softly. So someone killed him to prevent this going public. Not quite, said Whimsy. I think someone thought this was public and feared what others might learn. He walked to the table where the ceremonial Bible stand had been set aside. He touched it delicately. Imagine you're the killer. You come to the vestry. You confront Dominic. You struggle. He falls. It's an accident. Or maybe not. You panic. You hide the folio. You vanish through the cloister door, limping to disguise your gait, wearing a coat that could belong to the groom. Then you return, blameless, grieving. But who? That, said Whimsy, requires a final test. And I have just the idea. Theatrical, naturally. I'll need a lantern, a phonograph, and Miss Elvira Stokes. Keeling blinked. Why her? Because, said Whimsy, she was the only one who noticed the figure limping away, and I intend to make her see him again. He smiled, this time under better lighting. The sun was dipping low beyond the hedgerows of Great Pagwell, casting long ecclesiastical shadows across the churchyard. The mossy stones turned gold in the fading light, but Lord Peter Whimsy paid them no heed. He stood at the edge of the cloister, path with Sergeant Keeling, quietly adjusting the angle of the lantern he'd had brought from the sacristy. Beside it stood a battered phonograph, borrowed from the vicar's sitting room under protest, and an old recording of Plainsong cued to play at the right moment. The effect, Whimsy assured the sergeant, was atmospheric coercion. Elvira Stokes arrived precisely as requested, escorted somewhat stiffly by Fenella Brooke, who refused to let her cousin go about after dusk without company. Elvira looked skeptical but curious, which was precisely what Whimsy intended. You said, you saw someone leave the vestry, he began, tall, limping, wearing a dark coat, and you've not been able to recall more? No, she said, brows drawn. It was just a glimpse, like a shadow walking. Good, said Whimsy. Tonight, I want you to try again. Walk with me, if you would. He guided her back toward the exact angle of view she'd had earlier that day, near the south transept, where the cloister walk formed a sort of natural corridor between hedges and stone. The shadows here were deepest. The path curved just enough to conceal movement. Now, he said softly, watch. He signaled to Keeling, who dimmed the lantern and started the phonograph. A low, mournful chant filled the air, eerie and ancient, echoing faintly along the walls. The garden was still. Then a figure appeared, at the far end of the cloister, tall, dark-coated, limping unmistakably just as before. He moved slowly as though uncertain, the lantern casting his elongated silhouette against the wall. Whimsy stood very still beside Elvira. She gasped. Yes, that's exactly it. Look carefully, said Whimsy. You know this man. The figure stepped closer, under the full light of the lantern. The coat came into full view, the posture clearer now, a slight hunch at the shoulder, the hand tucked inside the pocket. And then, as the head turned and caught the edge of the light, "Oh, my God," whispered Elvira. "You see it now?" She nodded, stunned. "It's the doctor. Dr. Weatherstone." Whimsy exhaled almost gently. "Yes," he said. "It is." Keeling cut the phonograph. The illusion faded with the sound. The man in the coat, actually a constable wearing garments borrowed from the vicar's wardrobe, lowered the lantern and stepped aside. "I wasn't certain," Whimsy said softly to Keeling, "but the limp, entirely manufactured. No one among the staff walks that way. But Weatherstone this morning complained of a strained tendon, said he slipped last week on his garden path. Minor, he said, but he's favored that leg ever since. You think he killed Mew?" "I think," Whimsy replied, "that Dominic Mew's little dramatics were aimed at more than one audience. He had letters, secrets, perhaps too many. Weatherstone, after all, is more than the village doctor. He's the Molland family's physician, privy to their histories, and Dominic knew something that frightened him. Keeling frowned. We need more than a limp and a borrowed coat. Indeed, said Wimsey. We need the rest of the play. They found Dr. Weatherstone in the rectory parlour, sipping something dark and unrepentant from a decanter. He looked up as they entered, startled but quickly composed. Lord Peter, Sergeant, still turning over stones, are we? Only the more decorative ones, Wimsey said, seating himself across from the man with practiced ease. Tell me, Doctor, did you attend the Molland family in Vienna about 3 years ago? The glass paused near Weatherstone's lips. No, he said. Never been. Ah, said Wimsey, then you'll be surprised to hear your name in a certain letter addressed to a Viennese clinic. Inquired after a girl named Clara Stein. Charming handwriting. Yours, I think. Weatherstone's smile thinned. Clara was a patient, a case that involved difficulties. I referred her to a specialist abroad. Confidential, naturally. Of course, Wimsey said, except that Dominic Mew also knew of her, and threatened to reveal the connection between her and Nicholas. She was more than a patient, wasn't she? Weatherstone didn't answer. She was, Wimsey continued softly, a girl Nicholas became involved with during a sanatorium stay. Treated for something delicate. You signed the intake forms. None of this is relevant, snapped Weatherstone. It's tragic, yes, but it doesn't make me a murderer. No, Wimsey agreed. What makes you a murderer is the fact that Dominic threatened to name you in his little play, the folio we found in the shed. He included scenes that hinted at professional misconduct, a manipulated diagnosis, a cover-up, and most damningly, the girl's miscarriage under your care. Weatherstone stood suddenly, breath-catching. You've no proof of that. We have the folio, Wimsey said. Your name's redacted, but the details are there. Names changed, but the role's unmistakable. It was his final performance. And you killed him to keep the curtain from rising. For a long moment the room was very quiet. Then the doctor laughed, but it was brittle. I didn't mean to, he said at last. I confronted him that morning, in the vestry. I begged him to destroy the manuscript. He refused, said the truth deserved light. I lost my temper. He turned away, laughed at me, and there was the Bible stand, and He sat down heavily. I didn't plan it. I only wanted to scare him, but he fell, said Wimsey quietly, and died. And then, clever man that you are, you concocted a little illusion, limped out in a coat that could belong to the groom, hid the folio, disappeared. I thought it would pass, Weatherstone murmured, that it would be blamed on jealousy or madness, that no one would look too closely at a doctor. Then you've not met many mystery readers, Wimsey said with mild amusement. They always suspect the doctor. Comes right after the butler. Keeling stepped forward and took the man gently by the arm. Weatherstone did not resist. It was fully dark by the time Wimsey returned to the church for one last look. The lantern cast his shadow up the nave, tall and flickering. The vestry was quiet again. The cloth laid over the place where Dominic had fallen, now replaced with a clean white linen. Wimsey lingered a moment. He imagined the young playwright standing here, dramatic and doomed, too fond of secrets, too clever, for safety. And yet, in his own theatrical way, he had left every clue disguised as fiction. It had merely required someone to see past the staging. Outside, the bells struck 9. Wimsey turned and walked away. He had a train to catch, and a quote from Euripides already forming on his tongue. By the time Lord Peter Wimsey stepped into the quiet gloom of the Molland Manor library, the air had turned autumnal, sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and closing fireplaces. A single lamp burned low on the writing desk, casting a warm haze over the bookshelves and revealing faint dust in the lamplight, a domestic stillness that had become, in the last 24 hours, deeply deceptive. Murder does that to a household. It shifts the light, distorts the corners. Everything looks the same and nothing does. He was not alone long. Clarice Netheridge entered a few minutes after him, still gloved, still composed, though something about the set of her mouth suggested that composure had begun to cost her effort. I heard, she said. It was Weatherstone. Yes, Wimsey replied. He confessed. Not quite in those words, but with the clarity of a man whose performance has come to an unplanned close. She stood near the fire but did not ask to sit. He was never cruel, she said after a pause. But he was ambitious and afraid. The sort of man who keeps things neat, not moral, just contained. That's exactly the sort of man, Whimsy said, who panics when someone threatens to make a mess. Her gaze flicked to him. And what happens now? That depends. His confession is on record. The folio manuscript will be taken into evidence. Nicholas and Agatha, provided their nerves survive the shock, may still marry, though I suspect it will be a somewhat more subdued affair the second time. Clarisse gave a sharp breath of amusement. If she still wants him, she might, Whimsy said. Truth does strange things to people, burns some bridges, strengthens others. She studied him a moment longer. And what of you, Lord? Peter? Do you always arrive just in time to untangle other people's tragedies? I prefer to arrive late, he said lightly. That way one avoids the hors d'oeuvres and catches the scandal at its ripest. She smiled faintly. And leaves before the washing up, if possible, though I find it's often the washing up that contains the best clues. She turned her head slightly, then walked to the desk and opened the drawer. From within it she drew a slim envelope, old and creased. She held it for a moment, then offered it to him without ceremony. Dominic wrote to me once, she said, years ago, when he first went abroad. It's nothing dramatic, just a thank you, but I've never forgotten it. Whimsy opened the envelope delicately. The handwriting was unmistakable, angular, quick, flamboyant in its loops. Dearest Clarisse, I suspect I'll never understand the nature of restraint the way you do. I throw things onto the page because I cannot keep them inside, but you hold silence like a weapon. I admire it. I fear it. I hope never to be on the wrong end of it. Yours. De Whimsy folded the letter and handed it back. He wasn't. Wrong, he said. She looked up, surprised. You think I'm dangerous? I think you're careful, he said, and I think that's far more powerful. He bowed slightly, then took his leave. He had no desire to press her further. Whatever else she knew or feared would stay with her, locked behind that elegant exterior like wine in a dark cellar, quiet, well-aged, and never meant to be uncorked. Outside, the village was drawing curtains and turning down beds. Keeling met Whimsy on the church path, his uniform cloak drawn tight against the rising wind. The sergeant had the satisfied look of a man who, despite everything, might yet get home in time for supper. All settled, he said. Weatherstone's in custody. We've got the manuscript, the letters, the folio, and the confession in your notebook. Well done, Whimsy murmured. Any word from Nicholas? Still stunned but not ungrateful, he says he'll postpone the wedding. Wants time for Agatha to recover. That's generous, Whimsy said. It also gives him space to quietly burn every letter ever sent to or from Vienna. Keeling chuckled. And the bride, in shock, but perhaps wiser for it. Whimsy paused by the lich gate, his gloved hand resting on the iron railing. You know, Sergeant, he said thoughtfully, it's the little lies that catch people out. Not the grand ones. Dominic's play was clever, but the killer never feared it in full, only the part that revealed the thing he believed no one knew. Keeling gave him a sideways glance. You think Weatherstone was the only one afraid? No, said Whimsy, just the one who acted on it. The next morning he breakfasted alone at the local inn, over tea that was lukewarm and eggs that bore too much resemblance to chalk. He read the Morning Post without really seeing it, his mind still tracing the folds of the folio, the timing of the bride's collapse, the borrowed coat, and the limp. It had been a good performance. Almost too good. He considered that, then wrote a short letter in firm spare hand. Dear Harriet, the stage has been struck and the actors dismissed, but I find myself still seated in the stalls, wondering if I missed the true ending. Have you ever noticed how the body, when found, always seems a little too convenient? As though it died at the perfect moment for discovery. Or am I becoming fanciful? Yours slightly tangled. P. He sealed the envelope and passed it to the innkeeper with instructions for post. Then he rose, paid his bill, and made his way to the Station, gloved, hatted, and humming a tune not entirely unlike the one Mrs. Appleby claimed to have heard before finding the body. Dominic Mew had written a play about secrets and guilt and timing. It had cost him his life. But somewhere, Whimsy suspected, the real drama had only just begun. The train to London creaked and sighed with each turn of the countryside, as if reluctant to bear the weight of Lord Peter Wimsey's silent thoughts. He sat in the second-class compartment by deliberate choice, alone, reading nothing, his fingers tapping a dissonant rhythm upon the windowsill. The newspaper lay folded beside him, unread since breakfast. Outside, the trees thinned into wide, grey fields stitched with hedgerows, but Whimsy watched none of it. His gaze, like his mind, was fixed inward, down and inward, into the curious absence of finality. It should have ended cleanly. Weatherstone's confession had aligned neatly with the evidence. The murder weapon, the missing folio, the motive, there was no element wildly askew. And yet, there it was again. The persistent itch behind the facts, the thing that refused to square. He drew the little notebook from his breast pocket and flipped through its pages, scanning again his own hastily scribbled impressions. At first glance, the murder had hinged on timing. Dominic in the vestry alone, the fatal blow delivered in a window of scarcely 15 minutes. And yet, if Dominic had intended a confrontation that morning, if he expected to read or perform part of the manuscript to someone, then why was he alone? Whimsy frowned. Weatherstone claimed he had asked to meet Dominic in the vestry, but the manuscript, found in the garden shed, hidden as if in panic, indicated Dominic expected an audience. There were marginal notes, tone change on Nick's lie, wait for Clarice's cue. Not the sort of notation one made for private confessions. These were stage directions, as if Dominic had expected to act the truth into being. So where was the second chair? There had only been one in the secret robing room behind the vestry. Only one cup, one ashtray, one note. Everything set for a monologue, not a duet. Unless the duet was scheduled later, unless Dominic was rehearsing alone and someone else, interrupted, unplanned. Whimsy leaned forward, breath held. That would make Weatherstone's story incomplete at best. Or worse, someone else arrived first. He snapped the notebook shut. The train gave a shudder and began to slow, its long, low whistle echoing through an overcast stretch of moorland. A thought passed through him then, sharp and ridiculous. What if Dominic wasn't supposed to die at all? What if the performance he had planned was meant for someone else, and someone else had got there first? Back in London, he crossed the city with the abstracted urgency of a man watching shadows move ahead of him. His first call was to Parker, at Scotland Yard. A brief, coded conversation that prompted raised brows and quiet irritation, but resulted in the forwarding of a wire and a name. Clara Stein. She had, as it turned out, not returned to Vienna. She was living under another name in Sussex, in a small cottage rented 6 weeks ago under the alias C. Winters. And while Weatherstone had admitted knowledge of her, he had never once mentioned this to the constables. Whimsy sat quietly. With that detail, then he telephoned the station master at Great Pagwell. No, the man said. No lady fitting that description took the afternoon train. We've only seen the wedding party this week. No new visitors. So Clara Stein had not left the village, and the vicar had not mentioned any unusual confessions during the wedding preparations, but the sacristan, when pressed, remembered something peculiar. The west guest room at the rectory had been used the night before the ceremony by a friend of the bride, who kept to herself and left early that morning before breakfast, to walk in the fields. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. Clara had been there, not only in the village but in proximity, close enough to see Dominic, to speak with him, to perhaps learn what he intended to reveal. Had she known about the manuscript? Had she begged him to stop, or had she done something more desperate? By the next morning, Whimsy was back in Great Pagwell, coat trailing behind him like a black wing as he walked up the vicarage path. Inside, the air had gone strangely still. The rector was away, and the housekeeper, wide-eyed, led him upstairs to the west guest room, now unoccupied. Left in the night, she said. Didn't say goodbye. Left this on the dresser. It was a folded piece of parchment, unsigned. Couldn't let it happen. It wasn't his story to tell, I warned him. He said it would be fiction, but fiction, when it names the dead, becomes theft. I didn't mean to kill him. I only meant to stop the play, but he said her name, and I couldn't let him say mine. Whimsy turned the paper over. No name. But a single smudge of lilac-scented ink betrayed the perfume worn by only one woman that day, not Clarice, not Agatha. The scent the housekeeper had smelled faintly in the vestry, the one Dominic wore when he was found. Clara Stein had been there first. The murder, then, had two acts. Clara struck first. Perhaps not fatally. Perhaps she only meant to frighten him. And then, later, Weatherstone arrived and found Dominic already dying or dead. And he panicked. And made it his own. He had confessed not to the crime, but to the cover-up. Whimsy stood by the window watching fog rise in spirals off the wet fields. There would be no theatrical arrest. Clara was gone, perhaps out of the country already. And Weatherstone. He had confessed to a murder he didn't commit, but which he had willingly helped conceal. Guilt was a curious shape. It did not always match the crime. He left the house without a word, walking past the churchyard one last time. The bells were silent. The vestry door was locked. Back at the inn, a telegram waited. Message from C. Winters intercepted at Brighton Station. Passenger boarded early ferry to Dieppe. Too late for interception. Parker. Whimsy read it, nodded once, then tore it cleanly in two and dropped it in the fireplace. Some endings, he reflected, do not require applause. They require silence and, sometimes, grace. The fire in the inn's parlour crackled softly as Lord Peter Wimsey sat motionless in the high-backed chair, watching the two fragments of the telegram curl into ash. He did not stir until the paper was entirely consumed, leaving nothing but a faint scent of scorched ink and a thin trail of smoke that wound upward and disappeared into the chimney. Then and only then he exhaled. Clara was gone, and with her perhaps the final unrehearsed truth of the play Dominic Mew had tried to stage. It wasn't justice, precisely, not in the measured prosecutorial sense, but Whimsy, who had long since learned that truth and punishment rarely shook hands, found himself oddly at peace with the matter. It had been a story of overlapping performances. Clara's was the most haunting, a woman wounded by the way men had tried to frame her life into narrative. Weatherstone had cleaned up a mess he hadn't created, and by doing so became part of it. And Dominic, he had meant to speak truth, disguised as fiction, but he had not understood that for some people even fiction was violence. Whimsy rose and fetched his coat. Outside, the rain had begun again, fine and steady, a pattering whisper on the panes. He paused only to settle the bill, leaving a generous tip for the innkeeper, who, for all her keenness to gossip, had not once asked for an explanation. The village was quiet as he made his way back through the wet lanes toward the manor. There was one last matter to attend to, one more thread to tug. Not for justice, nor even for completeness, but because Lord Peter Wimsey had never much liked being lied to, by omission. Agatha Molland met him in the drawing-room. She looked drawn but not broken, sitting with a poise far removed from the wide-eyed bride who had collapsed in front of the altar. The wedding had been postponed, yes, but not cancelled. Not yet. "Lord Peter," she said as he entered, "I thought you'd already returned to London." "I tried," he said pleasantly, "but I remembered something on the train about an omission. Always a dangerous thing in a murder case, Miss Molland. Like a note left unsung at the climax of an aria." She watched him, eyes unreadable. "Spoke to the housekeeper," he went on, "the one who gave you the smelling salts. She mentioned you'd fainted just after seeing someone at the vestry door." Agatha said nothing. "You told me you thought it was Nicholas. But that wasn't true, was it?" "Still nothing." "It was Clara," Whimsy said gently. "You saw her there, dressed plainly, watching, and it wasn't her presence that made you faint. It was the realization that she wasn't gone, that the story Dominic threatened to tell might come out after all." Agatha turned her head slightly. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet. "I told Nicholas she had gone, that she was a mistake, an illness, something that could be treated and then buried. And Dominic refused to let it lie. He wanted to save me," she said bitterly. "He thought the truth would free me, but it wouldn't. It would only change the shape of the cage." Whimsy sat across from her. "You knew what Clara had done." A pause. Yes. She told you after the fact. No. Before. That made him blink. She came to me the night before, in the West Room, said she'd seen the manuscript, that Dominic meant to read it, said he wouldn't listen. To reason. She was frightened, not of Dominic, but of what the truth would do. She didn't want revenge. She wanted it to stop. She confessed to you? She didn't have to, Agatha said. I saw it in her eyes. And you let her leave? I let her go because it was never going to be her story, Lord Peter. No one would believe that. They'd say she was mad or scorned or jealous, but she wasn't. She was trying to protect us all. And Weatherstone? Whimsy asked. She closed her eyes briefly. I confronted him the next day, asked him if he'd known. He said no, but he lied. He always lies politely. Whimsy nodded. And Nicholas? Agatha met his gaze evenly. Nicholas is a man who loves the idea of devotion. He doesn't quite know what it costs. Whimsy folded his hands. So what now? I'm not sure, she said. The wedding's been postponed. I told Nicholas I needed time to think, and he, to his credit, didn't argue. You could walk away. I might. She paused, then added, but if I stay, it will be on my terms, not because the scandal was buried, because the truth, whatever shape it takes, is mine. Whimsy stood slowly. That, he said, is the most sensible thing anyone said in this whole affair. She gave him a faint, tired smile. You're not going to write a book about it? Certainly not, he said. Too messy. No clear villain, no tidy confession, and frankly, I don't fancy having my dialogue rewritten for the West End. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked back into the rain. Later, on the London-bound train once more, he opened his notebook for the final time. One blank page remained. He took his pen, and in deliberate, elegant strokes, wrote, Case of the second best man solution. Layered homicide, overlapping motives, obscured culpability. Final. Conclusion. Tragedy written as farce, staged as ceremony, concluded without applause. Dominant traits, guilt shared. Confession misdirected. Escape permitted. Miss Molland unlikely to wed. Mr. Fanshawe uncertain. Miss Stein vanished. Justice? Perhaps. Truth? Certainly, though one must squint. He closed the book with a quiet snap, leaned back against the cushion, and closed his eyes. Outside the window, the rain still fell. Inside the carriage, Lord Peter Whimsy began to hum, not Gregorian chant this time, but a low, wandering waltz that no one else recognized and he did not name. A tune, perhaps, for stories best left unfinished. The steady clatter of the train on the rails filled the carriage as Lord Peter Whimsy stared out into the grey drizzle of the London morning. The city was waking beneath the mist, a swirl of umbrellas and black coats, the distant clang of carriage bells and street vendors calling out their wares. But inside his mind the wheels turned more slowly, deliberate and measured, like the turning of some ancient clock mechanism, ticking down to an inevitable reckoning. He had left Great Pagwell behind, the village still steeped in its quiet secrets and whispered scandals. The case had unfolded like a carefully scripted drama, but as he now considered the final act, he sensed there was still one subtle note unresolved, a question lurking at the edge of the finale, too quiet for the stage but too persistent to ignore. His thoughts returned to Nicholas Fanshawe, the groom caught between past indiscretions and the weight of future expectations. The letter from Dominic Mew had laid bare the fragile thread by which the engagement hung, a thread strained further by Clara Stein's hidden presence and Weatherstone's ill-fated intervention. Yet, Whimsy suspected, there was more to Nicholas's story than cold feet or unfaithfulness. There was an unspoken tension beneath his words, an inner conflict that had not surfaced in their brief interview. And what of Agatha Molland? Her confession to Whimsy, her quiet acceptance of the cage built from truth and silence, suggested a woman grappling with forces larger than a mere broken engagement. Her strength was evident, but so too was a shadow of resignation. Whimsy reached for his notebook and jotted down a few notes, his pen moving with precise strokes. Fanshawe, more conflicted than confessed. Molland, guarded yet burdened. Stein, Catalyst yet elusive. Weatherstone. Fall guy or participant. He closed the book with a faint snap and leaned back, eyes closing briefly as the landscape blurred past. Then the sharp tap of a conductor at the door stirred him. A telegram pressed into his hand, sealed and stamped with urgency. He broke the seal and read quickly. Mr. Fanshawe detained at Southampton. Inquiry ongoing. Connection to Clara Stein under investigation. Further details pending. Wimsey's brow lifted. The thread was pulling taut again. Arriving in London, Wimsey made his way directly to the Yard. Inside the dim corridors, he found Parker awaiting him, expression unreadable. "Well," Wimsey began. "It seems our friend Nicholas is less free than we anticipated." Parker nodded. They picked him up boarding a steamer bound for the continent. Apparently he was trying to meet with Clara Stein again. They suspect he may have conspired to assist her escape. Conspiracy, Wimsey mused, is a delicate term. It may cover a multitude of gestures, some noble, some desperate. They moved to a quieter office. Parker slid a file across the table. Inside, statements and interviews painted a tangled picture. Nicholas had sought Clara not merely out of guilt, but because he feared for her safety. Someone had threatened her in recent days, warning her to remain silent or disappear entirely. "Who?" Wimsey asked. "That's what we're trying to find out." Clara's last known correspondences mention a shadow following her, someone with knowledge of the whole affair, someone dangerous. Wimsey rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Dangerous shadows often wear familiar faces. Over the next days, the investigation deepened. Questions unfolded like a labyrinth. Who truly pulled the strings behind Dominic's death? Was Weatherstone simply a frightened man acting in panic, or a piece in a larger design? And what of the mysterious warnings Clara received? Wimsey's own inquiries led him back to the Molland estate, where Clarice Netheridge had remained. In her quiet drawing room, she greeted him with measured warmth. "Lord Peter," she said, "the past refuses to settle. Each revelation seems to open new wounds." "Indeed," Wimsey agreed, "but I wonder if some wounds are necessary if they allow truth to breathe." She regarded him for a moment. "Are you suggesting there is more to this story? A deeper truth?" "Always," he smiled. "I find that justice is rarely a single event, it's a process, sometimes slow, sometimes cruel." Their conversation was interrupted by a discreet knock. A young maid entered bearing a small parcel. Clarice opened it carefully. A bundle of letters, some old, some new. "These arrived for you," the maid said. "Marked urgent." Clarice's hands trembled slightly as she sorted through them. Wimsey watched intently as she unfolded one, then another, her expression darkening. "These are from Clara," she whispered. "Warnings, confessions, pieces of a puzzle I had hoped to forget." Wimsey stepped closer. "May I see?" She handed him a letter, its script hurried but precise. "Dearest Clarice, the danger is closer than we thought. Dominic's death was not the end, it was a beginning. There are those who would silence us all to protect their names. Beware the doctor's kindness, it masks darker intentions. I fear I will not see another dawn in this country. Trust no one." Wimsey folded the letter slowly. "The plot thickens." Clarice nodded. "It appears the story is far from over." Wimsey's final meeting with Nicholas was held in the dim room of a police station, under watchful eyes. The groom was pale, weary, but resolved. "I did try to help Clara," Nicholas confessed. "I love Agatha, but I cannot abandon her friend, so to whatever fate awaits." "And the threats? The shadow you feared?" Nicholas hesitated. "I believe Weatherstone knew more than he admitted. His panic was not only for himself, but for others he served in silence." Wimsey's eyes sharpened. "Do you suspect a conspiracy beyond a single man's crime?" Nicholas swallowed. "Yes. There are secrets in that family, and in that village deeper than I dared imagine. I fear Dominic's death was a symptom, not a cause." Wimsey closed his notebook. "Then our task has expanded. This case is not just about murder. It is about the lies we live with and the truths we hide." Outside, the sky was clearing. The first rays of sun pierced the clouds, casting long golden fingers. across the city streets. The day was beginning anew, as were the mysteries that would demand Lord Peter Wimsey's attention, quietly, inexorably, until the final curtain fell. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall sash windows of the Yard's interview room, illuminating the dust motes that danced languidly in the stale air. Lord Peter Wimsey sat opposite Nicholas Fanshawe, whose weariness had deepened since their last meeting. The groom's hands trembled slightly as he toyed with a teacup, though his gaze was steadier now, more focused. "Mr. Fanshawe," Wimsey began, "you mentioned earlier that Dr. Weatherstone knew more than he admitted, that there are secrets beneath Great Pagwell's polite veneer that extend beyond the unfortunate death of Mr. Mew. I should like you to speak plainly, if you can." Nicholas sighed deeply and leaned back, as though the weight of unspoken truths pressed upon his very spine. "It is not just Weatherstone," he said quietly. "There is an undercurrent in that village, a web of old loyalties and quiet deals. Weatherstone, as the family physician, is a guardian of many things, some that ought to have remained hidden. Such as—" Nicholas's voice lowered. "The circumstances surrounding Clara Stein's condition. Her treatment in Vienna was not the whole story. There was a local matter long before involving another family secret, an incident covered up by those in power. Weatherstone has been protecting more than just health records. He has been safeguarding reputations and at times silencing inconvenient truths." Wimsey tapped his fingers thoughtfully. "I take it Dominic discovered this?" "Yes," Nicholas said, "and that discovery cost him dearly. He threatened to expose the hidden connections between the Molland family, Weatherstone, and Clara's past. He saw the wedding as a facade, a chance to cement silence. Yet Dominic's death was hastened by Weatherstone's hand." "But you believe others conspired?" Nicholas nodded slowly. "There are those who prefer Dominic silenced, yes, and who might see Weatherstone as a useful shield or convenient fall guy." Wimsey's eyes gleamed. "And who, precisely, stands to benefit from maintaining such secrecy?" Nicholas swallowed hard. "Clarice Netheridge." The name hung in the room like a sudden chill. Wimsey leaned forward. "Mrs. Netheridge?" "Yes. She has deep ties to the village's old power structures. Her first husband was a local magistrate. Her second, a landowner with considerable influence. She has long been the arbiter of what remains unsaid in Great Pagwell. Dominic's manuscript threatened her position." "And you believe she encouraged—" "Weatherstone?" Nicholas looked away. "I do." Wimsey nodded slowly, absorbing the implication. "This explains much. The reluctance to name her, the careful deference she commands, and why she guards the truth as fiercely as the family crypt." Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp knock of a constable entering to announce a visitor. Clarice Netheridge stepped inside, composed and inscrutable as ever. Her eyes swept the room coolly before resting on Wimsey. "I trust I am not interrupting?" she asked. "On the contrary," Wimsey said with a bow, "your presence is most timely." She crossed to the table, folding her gloved hands. "I understand there are questions." "Yes," Wimsey replied, "questions that may be uncomfortable." She smiled faintly, but her eyes were steely. "I have always believed that the truth is a blade best wielded with care." "Indeed," Wimsey said, "and yet it appears that blade has been wielded recklessly of late, resulting in Mr. Mew's death." Clarice's expression darkened. "A tragedy, yes, but accidents happen in the pursuit of secrets." "Accidents sometimes cover design," Wimsey countered. "Your influence over the village, your connections to the Molland family, your presence near the time and place of the murder. These are facts, Mrs. Netheridge." She regarded him with the calm of a chess master, contemplating a forced checkmate. "And yet no evidence links me directly to the crime." "Not yet," Wimsey said, "but it is telling that Dominic's manuscript, which implicated many, was kept from public view until too late." "Perhaps because the manuscript was fiction," Clarice said smoothly. "Exaggerated drama written by a man eager for sensation." "Or truth disguised," Wimsey said. "Fiction often reveals more than it conceals." There was a long silence. Then Clarice spoke, voice low. "I wished to protect the village, the families, the legacy. Dominic's revelations threatened to unravel all. And in doing so," Wimsey said quietly, You may have entangled yourself deeper than intended. Clarice's composure flickered, a shadow crossing her face. I am prepared to accept responsibility for my choices, but I am no murderer. Whimsy studied her. Perhaps not directly, but you wielded influence, you shaped actions, and sometimes— That is enough. She nodded slowly, the slightest trace of defeat in her posture. What would you have me do? Tell the truth, Whimsy said simply, not for justice's sake, but for the sake of those caught in the web. Clarice's gaze met his, steady now. I will consider your counsel. As she left, Whimsy turned to Nicholas. The path to resolution is long, but it begins with confession. Nicholas exhaled, the first breath of release in days. Outside, the city's hum resumed, the cacophony of life pressing forward as always. But within the walls of the yard, a quiet reckoning had begun, one that would unravel the tangled loyalties, expose the hidden motives, and perhaps, at last, bring peace to the shadows of Great Pagwell. Lord Peter Whimsy rose, his work far from done, yet satisfied that the first true act of justice had finally begun. The late afternoon light filtered through the heavy curtains of the interview room, casting long shadows that seemed to gather around Clarice Netheridge as she sat with deliberate composure opposite Lord Peter Whimsy. The air was thick with the unspoken weight of the conversation they were about to undertake, a final reckoning where veils were drawn back and truths laid bare. Mrs. Netheridge, Whimsy began, his voice calm yet unwavering, we have spoken of secrets and shadows, of influence wielded with care and carelessness alike, but now the question remains, how far did you go to protect that influence? How deeply are you entangled in the events that led to Mr. Mew's untimely death? She met his gaze steadily, unflinching. I have played my part, Lord Peter, but I am no common murderer. Dominic Mew was reckless, dangerous, and foolish. He sought to burn bridges that should have remained intact. I only sought to guard those bridges from collapsing entirely. And yet Mr. Mew lies dead and the bridges are fractured at best, Whimsy said softly. We must consider that protection can be a mask for darker deeds. Clarice's fingers tightened on the armrest. You suspect me of orchestrating the murder. I suspect that in the labyrinth of motives and fears, your hand may have nudged events beyond control, Whimsy replied. We know Weatherstone struck the fatal blow, but it is you who wielded the dagger of secrecy and influence that set the stage. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I arranged for Weatherstone to meet Dominic that morning, yes, to warn him away from his dangerous crusade. I hoped words alone would suffice. And when words failed, I did not instruct. Violence, she said, voice firmer. But I cannot deny I knew the stakes were high. Whimsy leaned forward. And Clara Stein? Her letters warn of a shadow following her. Do you deny any involvement in that? Clarice shook her head slowly. I wanted her gone. For the village's peace, for Agatha's future. I admit to warnings, to persuasion. But not threats, not harm. Yet threats were made, Whimsy noted. And someone made certain Dominic's manuscript never saw the light. There are many who would benefit from silence, she said. I cannot speak for them all. A silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Then Whimsy's expression softened. Mrs. Netheridge, the time for guarded facades is over. If you seek mercy, it begins with full truth. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with resolve. There was one more presence that morning, she confessed. Someone Dominic trusted more than any of us. Someone he thought might understand his intentions and protect him. And who was that? Whimsy asked, voice steady. Agatha, Clarice said quietly. Dominic sought to confide in her before revealing anything else, but fear and love twisted their bond. Agatha did not believe him, or perhaps refused to. The truth was too heavy. Whimsy nodded. And what of Agatha's fainting? Was it merely shock? No, Clarice said. It was dread. Knowing what Dominic intended, and fearing what it would unleash. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. Then the tragedy lies not just in death, but in silence and mistrust. Clarice's hands unclenched. Yes. He stood slowly, signaling the end of their interview. Thank you, Mrs. Netheridge. Your candor brings us closer to closure. As she was escorted away, Whimsy felt a familiar mix of satisfaction and melancholy. The final act was unfolding, but with it came the realization that some wounds remained open, and some truths came at a high cost. Back in the quiet corridors of the yard, Whimsy prepared his report, detailing the complex web of motives, fears, and loyalties that culminated in the tragic death of Dominic Mew. He included Clarice's confession, Nicholas's fears, Agatha's silent struggles, and Weatherstone's fatal panic. His concluding note was brief and poignant. Justice has many faces, some merciful, some harsh. The second-best man paid the price for secrets too tightly held. May those left behind find the courage to speak freely and the grace to forgive.